because I had to deal with, two children that my late husband and I had adopted, and being widowed suddenly and a career. So I couldn't allow myself to dwell on the whole emotional response to what had happened with those losses. And later in life, as you know, sometimes those things come up again. And if you don't engage them, you don't live your full life. So this is a time to do that. And it's also a time I just felt to show something that academics usually don't show, which is how their scholarly work coincides, connects with, relates to the issues they have to deal with, because I'm convinced that the best and most passionate work always does. Certainly mine does. And so I just thought it was a very interesting attempt to speak in a voice that connected the historical reflection with the experiential issues.
Going chronologically back in time, tell us about your parents' attitude to religion and to your attendance at an early age at a Billy Graham event in San Francisco.
Yes, well, that's an unusual place for me to start, I thought, because my family was Protestant in a kind of cultural sense, but not religious particularly, because my father, as I wrote, had given it all up for Darwin. He had been brought up in a very ferocious kind of Presbyterianism, in which everyone was dangling over the fires of hell. And he said it caused a lot of conflict in his parents' family. So he left it for very good reasons as soon as he found Darwin. But then he assumed that religion was simply for uneducated people. It's for ignorant people who just don't understand science. So that's the way I was brought up. And then, as you say, Jeffrey, well, it was a boring Sunday afternoon in Palo Alto in California. And I was invited to go to San Francisco for something. I didn't know who Billy Graham was. But I went with some friends in high school. I was 14. And this extraordinary preacher started to preach. There were, 18,000 people in the sports stadium, right? And there were maybe 5,000 in the choir. And Billy Graham was an extraordinary preacher, and he was saying things that startled me about the way I'd grown up without any sense of a spiritual dimension. And then he invited the audience to be born again. And I thought, wow, I'm 14. I want to start over. I want to have my own life. I want to, this was an adventure. And it was very powerful and moving experience. So I went down and was, part of those who were saved that day.
And then you joined a congregation, didn't you? Was it in Palo Alto? And then you had an unusual experience when a Jewish friend of yours died in a car crash, and that changed your attitude about the congregation. Can you explain that?
Very much so. After the Billy Graham crusade, I joined an evangelical church, and I thought it was a powerful experience, actually. It was a strong group. We were living in a drama that included God and Satan and cosmic forces. It was quite extraordinary for somebody who'd been told there was no such thing as a spiritual dimension. But when one of my friends in high school, he was 16, was killed in an automobile accident, it was so shocking to the people involved. It was extraordinary because we were very close friends. And I went back to the evangelical church and I said, this terrible thing happened. My friend was killed in an accident. And they said, oh, I'm so sorry. Was he born again? And I said, no, he was Jewish. And they said, oh, well, then he's in hell. And frankly, I felt as though I'd been smacked in the stomach. I mean, I was really stunned because nothing that drew me to that group had prepared me for that kind of dismissal of somebody who was outside of that group. And I just realized I didn't belong there anymore. So I just walked out feeling very lonely, and I never went back.
You had another friend who was also injured in a car crash, Jerry Garcia of Grateful Dead. That was an unusual friendship that you developed. Can you tell us about that?
Well, he wasn't Jerry Garcia as he was later. He was in his 20s. He was a roving musician, wandering around playing extraordinary music. And we had a circle of sort of friends who loved poetry and music and dance and were concerned about, politics. And yes, we had a wonderful group of friends, and Jerry Garcia was one of them. It was 5 years after that accident in which our friend was killed that he started a band that he called the Grateful Dead. And I realized that the name of that group came out of the fact that Jerry was almost killed, and so was another friend, Ellen Trist, who was in the same accident.
Now, years later, what brought you to the study of religious texts? Did you proceed with an idea of what you might discover, or were you just completely open-minded about it when you initially started it?
Well, I didn't plan to do that. I went to New York to study dance because I was fascinated by that. And it was only when I realized that I was only pretty good and not good enough to be a professional dancer that I thought about graduate school. And I actually applied in 5 different fields to 5 different universities.
And what led you into the study of religious texts?
Well, the only one where you could study religion, which wasn't a religious school. I mean, I didn't want to be brainwashed, and I was a little worried about that after being in a very closed group. So the only program in the study of religion for a PhD was at Harvard. And when that acceptance came, I just knew I was fascinated because I thought, what hit me back there when I was 14? There was some powerful experience. Was it religion? Could it have been Buddhism? Was it about Christianity? What is it about these traditions I was told were insignificant that seemed to me so powerful? So I went off to find out. And that's when I discovered the secret gospels that I had no idea existed.
And tell us about your relationship.
Right now, I can't hear you, Jeffrey.
What was your relationship with?
I still somehow
can't hear me?
The sound.
Can you hear me now?
I'm not hearing you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me, Dennis?
Yes, I can.
Can you hear me, Elaine?
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Elaine,
Yeah,
I
I
can.
can't hear either of you right now.
Oh.
Huh.
That's odd. And I'm not a technical guru enough to, let's see, she's not on mute. You're not on mute.
I don't know if it's that, Helen. It's just, I'm so sorry. You can hear me, right? But
Yes.
Yes.
now I can hear you. This is fine.
Okay.
Now you can
There we
hear?
go.
Yes.
Okay. How did your professors at Harvard react to having a woman as a student in this field? Were you unusual in that respect?
Well, yes, they didn't accept women. I mean, I had gotten a letter from the dean, who later became a wonderful friend, Christer Stendahl, saying, well, ordinarily we'd admit a student with your qualifications, but frankly, we had bad luck with women. They always quit the doctoral program. They never finish. So we can't really admit you. But if you're still serious a year from now, we'll admit you. And I thought, what do you mean still serious? So I just spent another year studying Greek because I knew I'd need all the language I could get. And I went off there and I had a wonderful time at Harvard for the most part, discovering that these secret gospels that none of us knew what to do with them. We were just told they were terrible heretical texts. And I just found them quite wonderful and illuminating, and I still do.
And tell me about the reaction that you got to the Gnostic Gospels when it was first published. How did your professors and others react to it?
Well, it was quite startling to many people, and many people in my field, they only heard that there were heretical gospels out there, and these were bad ones, you know. And so writing this book shocked a lot of people, and some of them, including my professors, really disliked what I wrote, and others loved it. So I got hate mail. I had a whole cardboard box full of mail, and some of it was really horrible because people feel very strongly about their religious commitments. And I was suggesting that there were other gospels that they hadn't heard of, which there are. I mean, now most scholars know that.
And the Gnostic Gospels has pretty much been accepted now after all the turmoil that it originally created. Am I correct?
Well, absolutely. They're accepted to be early sources written around the time of the other Gospels, probably a little later. And they're part of the picture of the early Christian movement. So now we have a much fuller picture, because before that, it was, the only story that was told was the story of the group that later called itself Orthodox. Now we know it was a much more multiform movement with many different perceptions of Jesus and many ways of finding a path to follow his teaching.
Now, your husband was a scientist, and how did the two of you reconcile your respective interests in science and religion? You often hear of conflict between those two disciplines, and yet I assume that there wasn't any conflict there.
Well, there certainly can be. I mean, when we first went out together, he said to me, he asked the question, why religion? You know, why don't you do something that has impact in the real world? And I sort of looked at him and I said, why do you study elementary particles? I mean, you can't see them. I mean, you know, physics, why physics? And he was baffled by it. But as soon as he understood the intellectual challenge of discovering what these texts were about and how they amplified our understanding of the whole tradition in a wonderful way, he really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed physics very much because it's very imaginative. I mean, what the physicists do and the way they think about the universe is a language I don't speak, but it was one that I loved finding out about. And it was more about our closeness than about our fields. It was a really lucky marriage.
Speaking of which, one of the most moving parts of your book I found was the death of your son and the death of your husband. Would you tell us about that?
Well, shockingly, they coincided almost. This was at the time my whole family. This wonderful man that we had been married for 22 years. And our son, Mark, was diagnosed when he was 2 with pulmonary hypertension, which is, the doctor said, is invariably fatal. I'll never forget that phrase. It closes down the lungs. And there was no treatment and there was no cure. So we lived with that knowledge for the 6 years of his life. And he had a wonderful life. But he died, of course, at 6, and we were devastated. We anticipated devastation, and that's what happened. And we adopted another child at the time, and then a second child after his death. Then, totally shockingly, he was hiking in the Colorado mountains, as he did every summer, as he did every week, twice a week, Wednesday and Saturday. The physicist who loved the outdoors, who loved the mountains, would go out hiking. And he was hiking on a peak in Colorado near the physics center and fell and probably died instantly. It was horrendously shocking. And I just thought I would never recover, actually.
And tell us about your relationship with the monks there following your husband's death.
Well, I'd been very lucky to get to know a group of Trappist monks, Roman Catholics, a tradition that I didn't know about much. They have a monastery way up in the mountains. I was introduced to them by Robert Mann, who was the founder of the Juilliard String Quartet. And Bobby, as we all called him, had gotten to know the monks, he and his son. And they went up to play music for the monks at the monastery, and they invited my husband and me, and we got to know these remarkable monks. It was a wonderful friendship, and they taught me how to meditate. And they're not interested in dogma. They talk about centering prayer. Thomas Keating was the leader of that group, a man of tremendous spiritual depth. So after my husband's death, the monks offered to do a mass for him, which was so alien to him. But I was so touched by it that they did. They came to the funeral actually dressed in regular clothes, but I knew it was the monks. Nobody else knew who they were. They came into town, which they never do. And they were very supportive. And I thought if they had taken women at the time, I would have joined the monastery for a while. But I had 2 babies to take care of at the time. We had a 3-month-old baby then and a 2-year-old. And I had to focus on the children. But the monks were a great support.
And in addition to the Gnostic Gospels, you also wrote, I found fascinating books about Thomas and also Satan. Would you talk a little bit about those books and the kind of reception that they received?
Yes, well, after these 2 catastrophic events happened, I remember the minister in Colorado who preached the funeral sermon said to me, I shouldn't be angry at God. And I sort of looked at him and I thought, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not angry at God. I don't think God does this stuff. I don't think it was planned that way. So I'm not angry at God. I thought in the ancient world, people would be angry at Satan, because if you believed in Satan, they thought Satan is the one who creates obstacles for people. And I didn't think of Satan as an actual being, but I thought, why did people invent Satan? Because you had talked when we spoke earlier about the Jewish tradition of being angry at God when there's terrible wrong in the world. And that is a tradition that the prophets take up, right? One rails at the Lord.
Right.
Because you only have one person there, one there. But if you have Satan, you have someone else that you could blame for things that go wrong. So I decided it would be just an interesting way to deal with my own turbulent emotional grief and distress, to find out how people came up with this figure of Satan. And it happens in Jewish and Christian groups around 2,000 years ago. I realized that Satan then became a way of talking about people close to you who are against you or on the other side. And I came to realize, and this was really a shock, Jeffrey, that in the New Testament, the story of the death of Jesus, the death of Jesus was blamed on his own people instead of on the Romans who actually crucified him for insurrection against Rome. And Satan becomes a player in the story. And I realized the story was actually an originating point for Christian anti-Judaism, which shocked me. I just had no idea. I wasn't looking for that. I didn't want to find it. And there it was. So these mythical stories turned out to have real social consequences, real impact in the world, as my late husband would have said. And they still have for thousands of years. So I had to write about that. And that's what I did in the years after my husband's death. It was a powerful thing to write about, actually.
Can you explain a little more about how the idea of Satan led to ongoing anti-Semitism in the world?
I'm sorry, would you say that again?
How did the idea of Satan create ongoing anti-Semitism throughout the ages?
Well, it didn't. It was a way of talking about, if you think about the heavenly world split between God and Satan, what I realize is you're also thinking about the human world split between people who follow God and people who follow Satan. That's what you find at the Dead Sea Scrolls in Jewish sources around the time of Jesus, that some people are in Israel are misled, and it's blamed on the powers of evil. So it is sort of as above, so below. If you believe the universe is split like that, people who believe in Satan even today, right, and take Satan seriously, they are not just talking about a supernatural being up there. They know exactly who they're talking about, and they could give you names and addresses. They know who is on Satan's side. So that's a way that Satan becomes an image for hostility. And in the New Testament, in the Gospels of Luke and also in John, it is a figure of Satan who comes into the story as someone who motivates members of the Jewish community to move against Jesus. And that becomes a story about Jesus rejected by his own people. And that became a story about anti-Semitism. So it was devastating to realize that. And yet it still works that way when people divide, say, today's world between God's people and Satan's people. Whether you're on this side, whether you're Christian, whether you're Muslim, that still works for people who are involved in those stories that way.
And what about the reaction that you got to your book about Thomas in Beyond Belief? Can you go into that a little bit?
Well, Beyond Belief was a book that I wrote because I love the Gospel of Thomas. And what I realized after those losses was people would say, oh, your faith must have been a great consolation to you. And after the loss of my son and my husband, I thought, I don't know what you're talking about. A time of very deep grief wasn't the time to talk to me about faith. Some people find faith in those very darkest moments. I found only darkness. And I realized, well, what do I love about these traditions anyway? And I realized it's what they say about human relationships. It's some of the teachings of Jesus. It's the conviction that light is greater than darkness. One of the secret gospels talks about a young man who goes out in the desert in a state of despair to kill himself. And as he does, as he steels himself to do so, he senses that there's a divine being present with him. And the divine being says, have you gone out of your mind? And he's taken into a luminous cloud and enlightened, he said, by some presence that he experiences. And then at the end of the story, he says, and then I realized that the light in me is greater than the darkness. It's a very beautiful thing. And the Gnostic Gospels and these other texts speak about the light in us being greater than the darkness that we live in sometimes. And also that the connection between people is deeper than anything else and more important. The connection between ourselves, and not only that, and the universe, the stars, the trees, the natural world, the divine source from which it came. That there's something mysterious and powerful about that. And that was very consoling, that sense, that experience that comes through some of those texts. So I wrote about that. And it was not, when I said beyond belief, it wasn't because I believed in any specific way. It was a kind of experiential path of hope through that darkness.
And in your investigations of historical texts, you also discovered more information about Judas as a very interesting figure. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you learned of Judas?
Well, the Gospel of Judas was discovered, I'm thinking, in 2005. we knew there was such a text. And what it showed, I mean, it's a late text. Somebody's writing a story about Judas. And when I was writing about this with my colleague at Harvard, Karen King, you realize that if you read the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, it just says that Judas betrayed Jesus to his enemies, told them where to find him, and they arrested him and they executed him. And the question was always why? So the other gospels, Matthew basically says he did it for money, but that's not in Mark. Luke says he did it because he was inspired by an evil spirit, some kind of jealousy. We don't know why. But in the ancient world, many followers of Jesus wondered about that. And they told different stories. That's one of the things you find out if you look at these secret gospels, Jeffrey, that there isn't one story about how things happened. There are actually quite a few. And I found that really fascinating.
It is. What do you think were the most salient points that those books made? And what do you think we can learn as non-scholars from these books about the various gospels?
Well, I think what we can find in these sources, they probably have a connection with Jewish mysticism and with Christian mysticism, and actually any form of that, because what they speak to is our experience, not so much to our minds and what we believe. It's not about believing in God or believing this or that about Jesus, so much as it is about a kind of sense of the divine reality that from which we come and to which we go. It's a trust in something like that. And these texts talk about our connection with that divine source and the fact that we can find it if we look hard enough, that we're not disconnected from the divine, that there's hidden links between us and God, actually. And this is based on Genesis, in which the first chapter says that God created humans in his image. And they say created in his image mean that we're connected, that we're related, that we can find a way back to the divine source if we look for it. And it seems to me that's what many traditions teach. And it doesn't necessarily specify how to do that, but they offer that promise of paths to follow.
You're a member of an Episcopal church in Princeton. How have your books influenced your perceptions and practices of ritual in the Episcopal church?
Well, you know, Jeffrey, I think it was the ritual in the church that influenced the books, because there was a time, and again, I guess I have to say it was after those losses, I came back, had to leave New York because I couldn't afford to live there anymore with 2 children, and moved to Princeton where I was teaching. And I would walk into this Episcopal church right down the block, and this extraordinary music would be sung, and Palestrina and Mozart and extraordinary, deep and powerful music, and the liturgy would open up. And the liturgy is designed to open us up, open our hearts, right? And the music also does that. So I would walk into that church and start to cry, because I couldn't ordinarily cry. I just didn't have time with 2 children and working. And it was too painful because I thought I'd never stop. But there was a way, there was a kind of home for that. There were people who understood about life and death and who had ways to deal with it, which I had not learned before. And so the liturgy and the music to me was deeper than any of the words that were spoken, but they're very ancient rituals that are created as ways of opening up to a divine, to something else, to something greater than ourselves.
What are you working on now?
Well, right now I'm working on teaching, which I love. I mean, my students at Princeton are amazing. And I'm getting ready to teach a class that I suggested to a colleague, Jonathan Gold. He's a specialist on Tibetan Buddhism, and he doesn't know much about Christianity. And I don't know much about Tibetan Buddhism, but he knows a lot. So I suggested we teach a course together for undergraduates called Jesus and Buddha, in which we would compare the life of Jesus and the life of the Buddha and the teachings and the communities they created and the ethics they taught and the spiritual teachings and what they teach about the afterlife and maybe the life before this life. If you're a Buddhist, there may be thousands of them. And it's really been a wonderful thing to work on. So that's one of the things. And I'm teaching another course called God and Satan, Goddesses and Monsters, which is about many religious traditions and how we engage them. Because I love teaching about this because somehow it opens up the students to speak about their interest in these questions of spirituality for which there may not be any very definitive answers, but which can lead us into different kinds of understanding, sometimes beyond words.
Thank you very much, Elaine. I think now that people may have some questions that they want to ask you. So I think Dennis has control of the Zoom and he can direct the questions to you.
Down at the reactions area at the bottom of your screen, there are several things. So there's one that's a waving hand. If you have a question and you hit on that, hopefully it will let me know that you have a question or that you've raised your hand or something like that. Elaine, I will start off in one way. For those lost gospels and those secret gospels and how they were vilified by the church, it is still amazing to me how much influence they had on iconography in the church. I think of the Proto-Evangelion of Matthew and the whole thing with Joseph. The statue of Joseph is what? Holding a staff with lilies. It comes out of one of those secret gospels, yet the Orthodox Church has captured some of the traditions from those gospels and allowed them to be still there to float through. And that is one of the things that I think has absolutely amazed me about some of those gospels, but yet how they were so nasty, but yet there they are in the iconography and the artwork and the statues and how we depict things. And my own encounter in postgraduate work was on what was called the Pia Fraus, the holy trick, and how God had to trick Satan into letting humans go free through the harrowing of hell, because he tricked humankind into sinning and rejecting God. So what you were saying about Satan, I think that was the great deceiver is quite a fascinating thing. And I want to thank you for leading me into those kinds of discoveries.
Well, I'm glad. I think there's a great richness in Christian tradition, and I think these add a great deal more. But I think they raised the question of which revelations about Jesus are authentic and which aren't. And the church created a canon, which means, of course, as you know, it's standard, which is what you're supposed to read in church. But some fathers of the church thought it was too misleading that these other gospels with other stories that kind you mentioned could lead people away. So they thought it was too risky. And they wanted to sort of keep it down to the gospels that are close together.
Bare minimum.
Yeah.
Is there anyone that has a question? Looking to see if I see any hands or motion or, okay, I do see one here. Let me see. Marion?
Yes, here I am.
Okay.
I have a question about the Mary. I'd love your feedback on the Mary Magdalene Gospels. I'm particularly interested in the men's reaction, even more so than what she says. Can you give me
in the Gospel of Mary, you mean?
Mary Magdalene?
Yes.
Yes.
You've read the Gospel of Mary
Yes.
Magdalene.
It's very,
Well, the Gospel of Mary was discovered in the 19th century, and the scholars who discovered it never published it. They published it, but they didn't think it was worth anything, because what was it about? It's about Mary Magdalene greeting the other disciples when they're discouraged and afraid to preach the gospel. And she says, brothers, stand up, have courage. The Son of Man is within you. And she said, you must go out and preach the gospel. And she says, the gospel says she gave them all courage. And then Peter says, tell us some of the words of the Savior that you know, that maybe we missed something he said. Tell us something that he said to you that he didn't tell us. And she said, yes, Peter, I'll tell you not only what he didn't tell you, but what he kept from you. Now that made Peter angry. Like, he was telling her things that he didn't tell me. And so the Gospel of Mary, interestingly, as you point out, shows an argument between Mary Magdalene and Peter about who is closer to Jesus, who understands him better. And of course, since Mary's gospel, she wins the argument. And because she wins the argument and is welcome to be a preacher at the end, the church censored this gospel because it suggested that women could be preachers, or possibly as close to Jesus, as authoritative as the male disciples. Now, you know that in the Gospel of Luke, there are 12 disciples, and there are the women, but the women aren't the disciples, and the disciples aren't the women. And that's very consistent to the church virtually to this day, certainly in the Catholic Church, right? Woman can't be a priest.
right.
Now, our church is different, fortunately, but that's taken a couple of millennia. So the Gospel of Mary is one of those remarkable texts that was censored. And one of the popes, as you know, later preached that Mary Magdalene was actually the prostitute who appears in the Gospels. And if she's a prostitute, she obviously can't be a spokesperson for Jesus. So that image of the prostitute is famous throughout Christian art. And the image of Mary Magdalene as the disciple disappeared until now. And now we see that it was really present in the early movement.
Thank you. Because Mary Magdalene fascinates me, and the fact that she was pretty much dismissed at the tomb. Okay, we'll take it from here. Thank you very much. Goodbye. And then, the gospel, reading the gospel, when Peter says, like, who are we to have to listen to a woman tell us? The misogyny started really early. I realized it was part of that culture, but it's something I wrestle with a lot,
Well,
I'm Catholic, maybe that's why I wrestle with it a lot.
And one of the writers who wrote about Mary Magdalene, the first woman apostle, points out that the sources that, like Peter, picture Mary as a woman who was possessed by demons in pretty negative ways. The sources that, like Mary Magdalene, picture Peter as somebody who just doesn't get it. So you realize that in the early movement, there was rivalry between different groups of apostles for whose version of the story would dominate.
Yeah. Okay.
And you know what the answer is.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Anybody else? Hillary, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay. I was wondering if you had ever heard of Ekaneswaran.
No?
He's a fascinating man. He was a professor of English literature in India. Let me just read this. I have his book right here. And then he came to the United States in 1959 as a Fulbright scholar. And he created the Blue Mountain Center for Meditation in 1961, which continues in California. But what I love about Iswaran is that he embraces all of the religious, I'm not good with these words because I'm not, he embraces all of it in his writings. And he uses gospel and things from other religions and things from all around the world to inspire people to go deeper into their faith.
Yes.
And I just, when I heard you speaking, I thought she might know him or know of him, and he's really wonderful.
Well, I think
He
there's
has written many books, but
there's
he's
a lot to explore. I don't know about his work, but
well, he passed away, but his writing is still quite out there.
thank you.
Yeah.
Good to know.
Thank you. I really loved this this talk.
Sal, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes. We know that the canonical Gospels are copied many times over
Yeah.
centuries. Given the fact that the Gnostic Gospels and the others that did not make it into the canon, do you think that they were copied less frequently, and therefore the versions we now have are actually truer to the originals than the four canonical Gospels?
That's a really interesting question. When you look at the garbage dumps in Egypt, where fragments of old papyrus are thrown, that's where many fragments of gospel texts have been found. Interestingly, at least by the 2nd century or the 3rd century, there are as many fragments of the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of the secret gospels, as there are of the Gospel of Matthew, and some of the Gospel of John. So we know up to that time, as you said, there are many copies, and they've been translated from Greek, in this case, into Coptic, because it was the language of Egypt at the time. So it was, all of them were being translated and copied a lot. After they were censored, you're right. I think probably the copies that were found in 1945 have not been revised and sort of, as you say, copied and then have things added to them. So that's a very interesting question. They probably are quite authentic. The Gospel of Thomas, I don't know if you've read it, but it has many sayings in it which are just the same as the ones you'll find in Matthew and in Luke, but it has others as well. The one that I always come back to is a saying in which Jesus says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. It's a statement about finding your way to the divine source yourself, which is a possibility in these texts. And another one which speaks of Jesus speaking of himself as though he were part of the entire universe of energy that created the stars, the trees, the universe, as well as the human world. So I like your comment. I hadn't thought of it that way. Thank you.
This is Heide speaking.
Okay.
I don't know if I could tell a joke on this illustrious panel, but
Absolutely.
copying reminds me, there is this joke about the little young monk who comes to a monastery, and these ancient texts, they needed again and again to be, of course, copied over. And there's always the danger that there's someone a little less, careful with the copying over. But anyway, he sends this young monk down to the bowels of the monastery to start copying. After a while, he wonders, where is he? Where is he? So he goes down and he finds the young monk with a bloody forehead, banging his head against the wall. It isn't celibate. It is celebrate. The R.
Oh, I get it. Yeah. That's funny.
I always like that.
It wouldn't have been in English, but anyway.
Yes, I mean, all that doesn't quite hold up, but it's still a very nice idea and comment on Christianity. It's celibate, maybe not, maybe it's more celebrate.
Well, there's a lot of celebration in these texts.
Yes, there is.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you. You were my savior many, 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 many years ago when I first discovered the Gnostic Gospels. So
Well,
thank you.
thank you. I think these texts have allowed a lot of us to love the tradition
Yes.
because it doesn't look so ossified as it sometimes can in some versions. You know, some Christians are very dogmatic, like this, you have to believe the way I believe it. And everybody else, I mean, if you're a Catholic, a Protestant, Pentecostalist, Russian Orthodox, Christian Scientist, I mean, there are many ways.
And they all enrich.
And
all
many
enrich.
people are fixated on exactly one way, when in fact, I like very much William James and the Varieties of Religious Experience, when he says there are people with very different temperaments. Some love the austere life of the celibate, like the monks up in Colorado, the Trappist monks, and some like the great celebrations of the churches and with processions and music and dancing in the streets that you find in other parts of the world. So there are many traditions that different people may need, and different messages perhaps that speak to each of us in different ways.
Yes.
Thank you for that. That's an important point.
Thank you.
I'm not having a twitch fit. My light goes out if I don't move enough. Anybody else? Sal again.
Yes. I believe there are over 50 Gospels that have been discovered that were not part of the canon.
Yes.
I can understand why the fathers did not consider some of them worthy of being put in the canon. The infancy Gospels of Jesus, even those Gnostic Gospels because of their Gnostic views. But what about the Gospel of Thomas? A collection of what, 113 sayings? Why do you think, I know it was being considered to be part of the canon, but then they decided not to include it with the four others. Why do you think it was excluded? Because it really has nothing but sayings, so there's nothing in there that can be contradictory to a storyline.
That's right. That's a very good point. I mean, as you say, they're called Gnostic Gospels. I called them that because that's what we thought they were. The Gospel of Thomas, and that often means, well, they're the bad ones, and they're dualistic, and they don't speak about one God, and they don't speak about the Creator. But the Gospel of Thomas is absolutely not that at all. It doesn't have that reputation as a heretical text. It has, as you said, many of this, half of it is identical with Matthew and Luke. The rest of it, however, suggests that you can find your way to to find access to God, that you can find it within yourself. And that wasn't censored until the 4th century, when Constantine wanted to create an established Orthodox church. And the bishops of that church said, famously, outside the church, there is no salvation. So you cannot you can't find your way to God yourself. You must be baptized in the Catholic Church, and this is your only hope, because God channels his grace through the Orthodox Church, and everything else is false and it will lead you astray, especially if you go off on your own looking for the divine source. These texts suggest that you don't need the church. You don't need a priest. You may not even need Jesus, except as a guide who speaks about the way you should go. So because they don't endorse the church as the sole hope of salvation, I think that is really significant. Of course, the church hadn't been invented in the 1st century in the way that it had in the 4th. But in the 4th, if you don't sign the creed, then you're out. So it's all a matter of believing in the creed or not. Before that, it was a rather more pluriform church. Might not have survived that way because organizations that don't have structure often don't continue. So it may be that we owe to orthodoxy the structure of the church that we have. But these are mystical traditions that recur, you know, as Father Brunel said, they come back. They come back in the teachings of George Fox, who's founded the Quaker movement. They come back in the language of the mystics. They come back in people who spontaneously discover some kind of spiritual truth.
Just checking here. Anybody else? I don't see any more hands. I'll go through one more time real quick. Nope, no more hands. Elaine, thank you so much.
Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you. It's really.
Marion just raised her hand.
Well, let's continue.
And so did Sal. That doesn't surprise me.
Let's
Marion, go first.
The courage on the way out.
Marion, you're muted.
Technology at my age, I don't know. I just wanted to say thank you so very much. This was so valuable and it was so informative and pleasurable. Thank you so much, especially Thomas. Now I'm really more and more curious. I've done some reading, but not that
Well,
much.
you know, the Gospel of Thomas to me is a very powerful, simple, beautiful book. And the book that I wrote about it, Beyond Belief, is one that is very close to my heart because it was kind of what got me through. And it wasn't meant to be separate from the others. It was meant to supplement them. So I think you might enjoy it as much as I do.
Thank you.
Al, did you have another one?
Woof, I just got.
No, I just wanted to say thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much, Elaine. Jeffrey, thank you for making the connection for us. And wish God's blessings on you, Elaine, and your family, and all of you who have joined. God's blessings on all of you as we enter these holiday/holy day moments. And please all keep safe. Don't forget masks, social distancing, to keep each other and mindful of each other, to keep all of us safe, that we can get through this craziness as soon as we can. Okay. God bless you all. Elaine.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Also-
Bye-bye.